Welcome to another episode of the Between Podcast. Hey, it's me, your host, Matt Mattson. Gosh, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for putting in your earbuds or turning up the volume on your automobile or however you're listening to us right now. Thanks. We've got a lot of people who listen to this podcast all over the country, all over the world. And we got a lot of people who come from a lot of different faith backgrounds, a lot of people who listen to it for a lot of different reasons. I think a lot of folks listen to it for some of the cool guests we have, like authors and thinkers and creators. Other people listen to it just because I think they're resonating with the idea of the space between us being sacred and really exploring how we can interact with people in a way that feels holy and that feels sacred and that maybe honors what our soul is calling out for. And I'm just so grateful for you for listening. And if you're watching, I know now, we got some video versions of this podcast. You could probably already see on the screen that we have a guest today, and it's a special guest. It's my very good friend, Reverend Dani Hillyer. Dani, you're here and you're going to introduce yourself. But before you do, I wanted to maybe tell our listeners that what we hope is that this might be a recurring, dynamic. Maybe Dani and I could be co-hosts every once in a while and can just engage in conversation around a topic that is relevant to the moment, that is relevant to what we're trying to unpack here on the podcast and within the Between community overall. And I'm really excited for that. But this is the very first time we're doing that. And so it's important, Dani, that maybe our listeners get to know you a little bit and find out a little bit about you. Let's start with resume, bio stuff, impress people with your LinkedIn profile or something first. And then maybe we can learn a little bit more about you, who you are underneath the bullet points. Dani, do you mind maybe first? Dani, thanks for being here, man. I'm super pumped to do this with you. Thanks so much for doing this. You've done a lot of stuff with Between in the past. You helped lead a worship service that we did back in December. You've gone live with me on Instagram before. You've delivered sermons for our little 5-minute sermons. You've delivered several of those over time. You've been a major, major partner and really just a friend and supporter to me deeply as I've dove deep into this Between project. And maybe let me start by saying thank you, Dani, and feel free to introduce yourself to whoever might be listening today.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for having me on. And even as you're introducing the podcast and introducing me just now, I was taken back to that one conversation that we had at Monk and Mongoose, that coffee shop that we go to often, but specifically about how you had this idea. And it was started with that, today I pray for you, and how we can have the simplicity of prayer in our everyday life. And then it grew into your favorite, your space between us is your favorite church. And I'll never forget that conversation, because then look at how much Between has grown and transformed and evolved, and how many people have listened and tuned in and taken it into their everyday life. So just a cool moment to look back.
Can I comment on that and say that, when I talk about creating cathedrals of connection in, coffee shop moments or these little momentary conversations, these little interactions we have. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dani. Like Between came from moments like that between you and I, and between me and a couple other people that, have helped to birth this idea. But the idea was birthed out of nothing. And then I got to have conversations with you and with other people. And in what I really believe is the magic of that space, like the energy of that space, the holy creation possibility in that space that we got to share at Monk and Mongoose several times. That's our coffee shop of choice, everybody. Monk and Mongoose in Centennial, Colorado, or wherever the heck it is. Everybody go check out Monk and Mongoose. This episode's featured sponsored by. But yeah, man, I think that's where Between came from, is that stuff. You're right about.
Thank you for being the mongoose to my monk, Matt.
I don't know anything about mongooses or mongoose. I don't know anything about them except that they eat snakes. I think that's true. I think they're like a natural predator to snakes. Everybody Google that and find out if that's real.
Please fact check us on that. Yes, so honored to be a part of this podcast. A little bit about me. I'm a native to Colorado, grew up here my whole life, only spent a few years wandering in the desert of Phoenix, Arizona, where I studied my undergraduate degree. But prior to that, I grew up, if we're talking faith, I grew up in a church. I grew up in a very a progressive, inclusive, ecumenical congregation, which at the time when I was younger, I had no idea what any of those things meant. But it's where most of my values of curiosity and inclusivity were instilled and were a firm foundation to what faith is. And then as I grew, I was heavily involved in this church. And then I grew and I was going off to college. And that's when I wandered to the desert of Phoenix, Arizona. And I attended Grand Canyon University. And at the time, it was a smaller university. It still is a private Christian university, but it's blown up. It is huge. It's tripled, quadrupled in size. I don't even know anymore. But when I attended there, that's where I was exposed to the vast diversity and varieties of theologies, of Christian beliefs. It was at that moment in time when, I thought to myself, we don't all believe the same things. And so that was really a foundational moment and also a dismantling moment for me of trying to think, okay, I was raised this way. I'm, 18, 19, 20 years old, and I'm being exposed to these types of things. But what aligns with my true identity? What aligns with my faith? What aligns with my values? I'll be honest, it was such a troubling time, a wrestle with my faith. There were moments when I would experience worship with some friends of mine or peers, and they'd hold worship nights or chapel services throughout the week at the university. And I would experience such incredible moments. And then there was always a few lines of something said, a lyric in a song that didn't sit right, that didn't resonate, that I really wrestled with. And so that's really where my faith journey started to snowball into what is all out there? What is there to study? I threw myself into so many types of ministries just to expose myself. And at the time, I was studying business management and sports management, thinking I was going to be some hot shot at ESPN. But on the side, I was like, oh, these ministries are kind of fun. And I was volunteering with refugees and this homeless ministry, and I'd do global mission. So I'd travel across seas and doing all these different partnerships with different types of ministries, really exposing myself to the entirety of what it means to be a church, what it means to be the body of Christ in the world. And then it was after that I still was set on being business sport management, but fell into a job at my home church, which Matt attends as well often, Columbine United Church, and they needed a children's youth director. I was young and out of money and needed to travel, so I gladly accepted that position. And it wasn't until I taught what the church teaches for youth ministry was 8th grade confirmation. And it's a time in this church and many churches where you're confirmed. You're confirmed in your Christian faith. Usually you've been baptized as an infant or baptized beforehand. And then you're confirmed in your faith that you've gone through, the program, the curriculum, you've researched and understood for yourself. But I remember teaching this class, right? And I've got business sports management in my head. And all of these students, these 12, 13, 14-year-old students are asking me, what is the resurrection? Is it physical? Is it spiritual? Well, who is the Holy Spirit? What does triune God even mean? And I will never forget feeling like a deer in the headlights in that moment. And there's there's strength in saying, I don't know. But when you're with 8th grade students and you're supposed to be teaching them, it's like, you should know a little bit more about this. But that's really when those 8th grade students that had relentless questions for me, and every answer I gave was never good enough for what they wanted to know. That's really when I felt a call to study more. And that's when I pursued a master's in divinity. I ended up I shopped several different seminaries, also finding that there's so many different types of seminaries that'll teach you based on their curriculum. I actually ended up going to a seminary for a few months and then getting in a pretty tight space where they wanted me to affirm their statement of faith that I didn't align with. And there was a falling out. So I left that seminary and found another seminary, McCormick Theological Seminary, based out of Chicago, Illinois. Had the most amazing experience, was again exposed to even more theologies that I had never even considered, thought of. Just incredible exposure, incredible time for me to wrestle yet again, to dismantle. They say seminaries a lot like the cemetery where your faith dies again and then resurrects in a new way and continues to evolve. So went there and then graduated and ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA as a minister. Oh, and somewhere along the way, I got married to my beloved husband. We had 2 kids. We've got a golden retriever. All of those things are simultaneously going on at the same time. But happy to be here, Matt. Happy to engage in conversations like this. I'm currently serving 2 different congregations in a partnership as the associate pastor of cultivation and innovation. Fancy way of just saying, how do we think beyond the walls of church as we know it?
It's fun reflecting on you. I know you pretty well, Dani, and I know your story. Anytime you get to hear somebody, I feel like this sometimes. Sometimes when I tell my own story, I remember, oh yeah, like that was a whole season. That was a whole
Mhm.
that's a layer of me that I still carry with me that I kind of don't think about every day, but it's always in there, right? And hearing you maybe name some of those professional layers and those faith layers that you've built over the years. I'm struck with you talking about you wandering in the desert for a little while, literally, because you did your undergraduate work in Phoenix. But a lot of people are forced to wander in a spiritual desert,
Mhm.
and it's not always comfortable, and it's often full of a lot of pain and sparked by some trauma. And I think it's okay to say, gosh, I wish everybody had a chance to safely spend some time wandering in a spiritual desert, wondering about how the faith of their youth applies to the faith of their adulthood and the faith of their future and the faith of the family they want to build and the faith of the kind of person they want to be now that they know who they are. There is so few people, I think, actually have a chance or actually have space in their life to prioritize asking those big questions. Today, by the way, listener, we're going to tackle a question or a concept that maybe circles around this idea of, can we worship in every moment? Should we worship in every moment? What does it mean to worship in every moment? Dani and I landed on that as a initial conversation for us to have. I mean, even that alone, right? Worship in every moment, even the idea of worship. What am I worshiping? Why am I worshiping? What's the objective of my worship? Who am I worshiping for? What does it mean to worship? Like all of those questions, I think most people, and this is to no fault of their own, because when would they have a chance to unpack this stuff? When would they have time to wander in their own spiritual desert safely without pains of trauma or pressure of families or denominations or a pastor who is pushing a little too hard in a particular direction? When would they have space to ask those big questions and to figure it out themselves? And I'm struck by right now, if I were to make a real vulnerable admission, this project, building between, putting pressure on myself to write a sermon nearly every week and to publicly share it with people that I respect and that I care for very much, and to ask myself, is that what I actually believe? Do I, man, there is A, that's hard, and B, what a gift. Like, what a sculpting of your soul gift and a refining of what is actually important to me, to be forced to write about it every week and to really think about it and to challenge myself around it. I wonder if you think about those times of your undergraduate time, your time leading youth ministry and being challenged by eighth graders, and your time in a seminary that didn't end well, and then a seminary experience that did end well, but that exposed you to a wide variety, the many, many, many different flavors of Christianity and faith. I wonder if you think about those times as a gift. I wonder if you think about those times as still unresolved, like you don't really know what they mean in your life yet. I'm just curious how you reflect on those times.
Yeah, I think about it's so true how even just sharing a little bit about myself and the journey that I've been on, specifically my faith journey, sends me back to those times that I do remember, crying on my dorm floor and just wondering what the heck is all of this? What is going on? But you know what was a constant and what I'm so grateful for, and he's been a mentor for a long time. He's still the senior pastor over at Columbine United Church, is Reverend Steve Poose Benson. At one point, when I was in the middle, I think it was like my sophomore year at Grand Canyon University, I came home and I went to church one Sunday, and he was asking me how it's going, and I said, I'm lost. Like, these people seem to have all the right answers about everything. And I don't have the answers. And it was so reassuring for me because he said, the ones to be most cautious of are the ones that have all the answers. And I loved that freedom, that liberation for me, almost leading me into we're asking the wrong questions. If we're trying to get to an answer, if we're trying to only look at faith as black and white, or there is a right or a wrong, there should be, some convictions. There's some 10 commandments, like, don't kill somebody kind of thing. That makes sense. But there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray in the Bible. There's a lot of gray in faith. I even joke, I'm ordained with the Presbyterian Church USA, and I joke it's because I'm 52% Presbyterian. Like, I'm most aligned with this denomination, and yet there's still a whole 48% side of my faith that worships differently, that experiences God differently, that understands and thinks and critically reflects so much differently, that can't be confined to any type of denomination or faith affiliation, really.
So I want to make sure we get into the topic that you and I plan to discuss today. And I think we can walk into this topic of what does it mean to worship in every moment. I think we can walk into that topic by first talking about moments. And
Mm.
maybe I'll ask you again, since our listeners are probably getting to know you a little bit. I wonder if you've got any stories, any moments, any memories of moments that felt sacred to you, maybe moments of sacred human connection. That's obviously what we spend a lot of time talking about here at Between, but moments, and let me maybe push that outside of a traditional worship experience and ask, do you have stories or moments or examples of sacred, holy, worshipful things that happened that didn't involve, everybody lighting candles and singing songs and, somebody giving a little homily at the beginning or the end? Do you got anything like that maybe might help people walk into your point of view?
Yeah. So I originally, when I first was thinking of this question, I thought of a specific between sermon that I've given about everything happens for a reason. I do want to maybe briefly touch on that later, but now what's coming to mind when I think of a worship moment that was spontaneous and out of your typical ordinary walls of a sanctuary, I think of a recent tragedy that struck our neighborhood. Our neighborhood's pretty close, and we had a beloved neighbor die very tragically, very isolated. And the day of his death, he lived alone. The day of his death, after everyone sort of filed home from their work days, and everybody heard from the neighbor down the street, heard from that neighbor, heard from that neighbor that he passed away, that he died, we all just spontaneously gathered in our neighbor's driveway. And we saw everybody kind of out there and bringing a lawn chair up, bringing a beverage up, and huddled together, sobbing, crying, telling stories. Most of them even saying, I didn't know him that well, but I always, relied on him and his happy hour on the front porch and the wave of, oh, the weather here in Colorado is doing something crazy again. And, you know, bringing flowers to his front porch and just sitting in that driveway, connecting with neighbors on a level that you don't usually get to connect with your neighbors on, because you're connecting over death and how fragile life is, and also how alone people feel, even when they're surrounded by loving neighbors. And it was the most worshipful, truthfully healing. None of us were invited to the funeral, the memorial service. None of us were invited to any of those things that go on with the family and friends. In fact, I couldn't even tell you the rest of his family's names, but he was our neighbor, and we gathered in tribute and honor to him in a concrete driveway on a autumn night in the dark with the garage lights on and coats and tears and love to fill that space between us.
That's a really that is a beautiful illustration of what connection looks like in practice, or maybe what the result of connections, even loose connections, even imperfect connections, even surface level connections, even I know my neighbor and I wave to him level connections.
Mhm.
There is meaning there that is profound, Can I ask you let me ask you a real question though. You as a pastor, I'm guessing your neighbors know that you work at a church and you're a pastor. A, did you feel like you needed to facilitate that experience? Did you become Pastor Danny on the concrete driveway? B, did they ask you to? Were they like, would you now, read about, the valley of the shadow of the, you know what I mean? I'm curious, what was that experience for you?
Yes. So the way that, my brain works and I operate, and especially, that pastor role that I try so hard to take off when I go home, it does come back on. And there was a moment, and I'm kind of laughing at myself for in the moment, I can so easily miss a moment, Matt. I can so get in my head and think about how do we make this sacred? And I'll never forget, I was looking at one of the neighbors and I said, "Should we do something in honor of him?" And she looked at me, she goes, "We're doing it right now."
Yeah.
It's like, and those are the moments that, like, because I've also been trained as a minister to create these rituals in life, to create these spaces that, gosh, sometimes you just need permission to say, no, being here is enough. Being in this space with other people, shedding tears is a ritual. This is a sacred practice in itself.
Danny, that is so on point for our topic today, and I'm not even sure you really meant to walk into it that way. But gosh Almighty, that last part of the story, you saying, "Well, she would do something," and your neighbor being, "No, we are. Look, we are." But like rituals are built for the result. Like I get myself in trouble here. I I believe in rituals and I believe in the power of rituals. And sometimes rituals produce things that are transcendent and beyond what I can understand. Also, I really believe most rituals, religious rituals, are built to create the result of people feeling connected with themselves and with something a little bit beyond each other, like each other and a little bit beyond each other, which was already happening. I just what a wise comment from your neighbor. Like, oh no, we already got there. Thank you.
No, 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 Pastor Danny, sit down.
I love that. I really love. But isn't that to the point of everyday worship?
Mm.
Worship in every moment. You were well. Let me ask you: was that worship? You were sitting on lawn chairs, a couple people holding a beer, probably
Mm.
on a driveway after a neighbor died. Was that worship?
Mhm. It was because of the way that the posture in which people came into that driveway, in which they were saddened, they were lamenting, we were troubled, and we were forced to face the reality of all of our expiration dates. We were forced to face the reality that tomorrow isn't promised, that we might not see that neighbor at happy hour the next night. And it came to this raw and real and vulnerable. And that word vulnerable, we love to hear about it, especially when Brene Brown is talking about vulnerability. We love it. But when we have to feel it, when we have to face it, we recognize we don't want to face it alone. And that's what was happening in that moment. As everyone was getting the news about his passing, that vulnerability needed a place to breathe. And it was in community with other people. And it was looking at other people and saying, hey, like, I'm right here. You might feel alone, but if you ever see my light on, just come say hi, kind of thing. And no, there wasn't, somebody didn't spontaneously pull out a guitar and we sing Amazing Grace, although there was so many moments I was like, that would be really cool right now. There was no official ritual, there was no candle lighting, any of that, but that sacred ritual of human connection. I think of the ministry of Jesus as I reflect on the scriptures of what Jesus did. Jesus was with people. And usually Jesus was with people in the most troubling times of their lives, of their collective lives, of their individual lives. Jesus was with them when they were lamenting, when they were full of grief. Jesus was rarely found in the temple. Jesus was rarely found in this confined space saying, this is worship. No, Jesus was like, let me in. I'm coming to dinner tonight. Wash your feet among me. Let us be in community with one another. And that's what that moment felt like. That moment felt like the rawness of what it means to live into Christ and to be in communion with other people.
Our conversations, Dani, often go in lots of different directions, and we will jump on tangents. So I think I may be taking us off track here for a moment. So before I go anywhere, let me say this. You led that last response by saying, yes, it was worship because of the posture people showed up with.
Mm.
I want to I literally wrote it down. I circled it. Maybe worship is a posture.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to come back to that because I can't help but comment on what you just said about in the scriptures, Jesus is with people all the time, except that he's not with people all the time. He's with people. There are times when he's alone. He's alone in the desert. He's alone. He goes in the garden. He's by himself. But did you ever think about, in order for somebody to write, if we take any of that at least surface level, like if we believe, like, I don't know, that story has some grain of truth to it. In order for somebody to have written down the story of Jesus in the garden by himself, or Jesus in the desert by himself, Jesus would have had to tell somebody
Mm-hmm.
about that moment. And can you imagine Jesus telling somebody about what happened in the garden, like admitting out loud, listen, friend, like I can only assume he told, a friend, a buddy, one of the, I don't know. And listen, this, I was just in a dark place, man. I was just in a place where I was calling out to my Father, calling out to God, and I don't know what to do with that, but I have to talk to somebody about it. That part's not in the scripture, everybody. I made that part. That's fanfic. But man, that, like, how else would the story be written? And what a talk about vulnerability. Like, he had to tell somebody about that, about what was in deep in his heart and what he was struggling with in those moments. Okay,
Mm.
so I just took us on a bunch of tangents there. Worship is a posture. Jesus had to tell stories about what he's alone. I don't know if any of that's helpful at all, but I am so drawn to the picture you painted of your community gathering together and worshiping in a alternative worship way in
Mm.
that driveway, because they all showed up with the right posture.
Yeah.
Dani, can we back up a little bit? Can I ask you about the word worship?
Mm.
Do you know anything about the word worship? Did you study that in seminary? Even just, what does it mean to you? And if a congregant came up to you and said, like, we say worship all the time, what the heck are we talking about here? Would you have an answer for that? I ask because I have to really think to come up with an answer to that question. And I don't feel like my answer is great, except now I have a sentence. Worship is a posture, and it's your sentence. Anyway, I'm curious. What's your default answer for what the heck is worship?
You know what is so funny about this too is, one, I'm having a triggering moment. So to become an ordained minister with the Peace USA, you have to go through a series of exams, and
Yeah.
one of them is on worship and sacrament. And they can, like, just ask, what is worship? Or they'll give you an example and they'll say, is this worship? And then you have to have exact details of why it is worship, and you pass fail kind of things. I'm so glad I'm not in that exam right now and just in a friendly conversation. But what's so funny, especially within my tradition, we have these two books that we say make up the constitution of our denomination, which is our book of confessions and our book of order. And our book of order keeps us aligned in our polity and also in worship. And I crack up when I read anything within the worship segment of the book, because there's almost no wrong answer, because everything is about God created matter. God created everything. And human beings created time. But God has God's time. But we create our 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. We have worship. And space, we create space, yet God created all of creation. So we're trying to create these worshipful moments within the bounds of our own understanding of time and space, with the reality that God has this infinite matter, this infinite creation of saying, where is it appropriate to worship? Can you worship on the lawn, or does it have to be in the sanctuary? And the reason I crack up at the book is because There's never a wrong answer. It says, that seems good. That seems good. That seems good. And so why I say posture is because you're coming into a space, acknowledging that it's sacred. Yes, maybe because of where it is, but more importantly, because of who you are with. So, for instance, our church, one of the churches that I serve, the heat went out in the sanctuary one Friday night and it didn't come back on Sunday morning. So we're like, well, let's move worship to a different part of the church. We gathered in our fellowship hall, nice and tight and warm, and nobody questioned it because it was who we were with. We threw in a keyboard, we grabbed a few microphones and a few amps, and that's worship. But we came in the posture knowing that we were going to be together on this Sunday morning, that we were going to read some scriptures, that we were going to hear a message, that we were going to sing some hymns, that we were going to create the worship time together based on how we were coming into the space with one another.
It reminds me of I may have mentioned on the podcast before, but I got a good friend who hosts a house church in Florida. And at his home, there's probably 8 other couples or families, like young families, maybe 10, that will gather, and they'll come over for dinner every Wednesday and have house church. And I was there. I was in Tampa on a Wednesday recently, and he hosted a house church. And everybody came over. We ate dinner, and we had a fire pit out in the backyard, and we sat out by the fire pit, and it was really fun and chit chat. And then everybody left. And I remember being like, RJ, is my buddy RJ. I was like, hey, was that right? Was that good? Did we do house church? And he laughed.
We do it right.
I already kind of knew the answer. I already kind of knew the answer, but he's like, yeah, that's church. Church is a table. And I always love, he will always say that church is a table, man. Like nothing else. Church is a table. And we gathered and we shared life and we loved each other. And this week, it didn't look like us talking about scripture and us praying together. It just looked like us eating and being and leaving. And that was enough this week. And there's something really profound in that. The permission to rethink about what it takes to fill our souls, to connect ourselves to the vine, to reimagine what it means to quote unquote worship. That is, for me, that's a really compelling conversation to have. Because if you open the door and give people permission to explore and experiment with lots of different, I'm not saying that has to be the way everybody worships. I'm not, or everybody experiences church, but what if it was an option? Because I think a lot of people don't even know that it's an option to think that way, to imagine that could be a thing that connects me to God or that makes me feel like my soul is filling, even if I don't even understand or believe in the idea of the word God. Like, what if we just gave people more space and more permission? To me, that is what's compelling about the idea of worship. I wonder what you think about that. Can that be like, I just, does the PCUSA say, oh, sorry, that can't be worship. You didn't have X, Y, and Z,
The PCUSA has their own response to this.
We'll leave that to them.
Yeah, we'll leave that to them. My response in this moment is that sometimes our idea of worship becomes an idol and it'll fail us if that is what we have of it. So if I come to church and I want the best hymn and I want, immaculate, just everything, like spotless pews, and I want it to smell good. I want the heat to be running just perfectly. I want the scripture text to align. I want the microphones to work appropriately and it's no static to come through and the choir and the message from the pastor. Then it becomes an idol. And we lose that posture. We lose that true connection and the humble reality that we are humans. We are humans attempting to worship God of the universe. And we're trying to make sense of how that is. And some denominations will say, well, it's about, using these songs, or it's about using this liturgy, or it's using this responsive prayer, or you must say the Lord's Prayer, or you must do communion on the first Sunday of every month, or every Sunday of the month. Like, my goodness, we get so stuck in our ways that sometimes we don't realize that the worship is the posture of us and the expectancy of God's presence and the Spirit to be among us, the Spirit to be moving us in those moments, calling us to connection, calling us to deeper understanding of ourselves, deeper understanding of our role in community and role in society with one another. So I think we often put worship on too high of a pedestal that we realize it is going to fail us. And I mean, I lead worship every Sunday, lead a church service. And I've even, for fun, gone to other churches to see what it's like. And I've left being so judgmental and critical and like, oh, the music was too loud. I couldn't see anything. They didn't have a bulletin. And then it's like, I wasn't worshiping. I was critiquing another church for doing it differently, or I was not fully participating. And that's what I think. I think there's a balance too, if I'm being honest, of individual worship and community worship and collective worship. And I think you have to have the balance of both, because there will be people who say, oh, I get my worship out on a hiking trail or out on the water or all of these places. And that's beautiful. Like, fill your soul with that connection to the vine, with that creation, with that moment of feeling close to God. And also, we were called to be with one another. We were created for connection. Just as this mission of between, like the space between us is already sacred, has already been blessed and sent, has already been God's ordination of life. And so how can we have that balance of, going to a worship service of a faith, of a tradition, of a church, and saying, there's things I don't fill my soul at that church service, but I also love to connect with people. I love to hear what's going on in other people's lives. I love to know that people are praying for me while I'm simultaneously praying for them. And also, I need a hike later this afternoon that's going to reconnect my soul in alignment.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this idea of, if worship is a posture, worship isn't something that you go and it happens to you. Worship is just how you show up, right? And you can show up with the posture of worship. I don't know if I believe this, but this is, I'm playing with these words right now because it is so compelling to me. Let me offer that not too long ago, I'll leave the details out, but I wrote a thing. I wrote a big thing, and I had somebody give me feedback on this big thing that I wrote. And the feedback was, you talk about sacred a lot. You talk about sacred moments of human connection. You use the word sacred a lot. Could you define, like, you have to include some definition of what the heck you mean when you say sacred? And it was good feedback. It was actually really good feedback. And then it forced me to write like a whole thing on what do I mean by that word? And I didn't use posture, but if you read what I wrote right now, Dani, you'd be like, oh, you meant the same thing that I meant when I said worship is posture. Sacred, something is sacred when you choose to name it as such. And when you approach it as something that you named as sacred, then it is sacred. This mug that I'm holding right now is sacred if I choose to approach, if I name it that and approach it that way.
Mm-hmm.
A church that does church dramatically different than me and makes me really uncomfortable and plays the wrong music and at the wrong volume, right? Like and the air conditioning's too cold. And if I choose to name that church as sacred, even if it makes me uncomfortable, and I approach it as, this is an opportunity for me to take a posture of humility, to take a posture of gratitude, to take a posture of connection, of attempting to connect. Then the content, I mean, maybe it makes you a little uncomfortable, but is that the point? Is church an intellectual exercise? Is worship an intellectual exercise? I don't think, for me, it isn't. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but for me, it isn't. I don't know, but that idea of, if you name it sacred, approach it as sacred, it has a pretty good chance of feeling sacred and you experiencing something sacred coming out of it.
You're throwing me back to a class I took in seminary. It was called Spiritual Practices. And the class came at the most perfect time. It was a summer course. It was the only course that I was taking. It was after my first intense year of seminary, where you're just dismantling everything you've ever believed in hopes that you'll rebuild something out of it. And when I took this spiritual practices class, it moved me out of my head. into my heart and into my body. And I'll never forget, as you lifted up your mug just now, the professor, had us bring something sacred to the conversation. And for a lot of us, it was like, this is my morning mug. This is the mug that I sip my hot coffee, my hot tea. This is the mug that, was gifted to me by a loved one that reminds me of the stillness that I can be in this moment, be present with the steam of the coffee. And the class was so profound in naming everything that we do in our day to day lives as ritual and as spiritual practices and as these sacred encounters because we're choosing to show up to them as such. Because whether we like to believe it or not, we all have ritual already in our lives. Whether we're the most disorganized or most organized person, we all have some sort of ritual in which we follow. And that is a part of that worshipful experience.
Yeah, Dani, there's a lot to dive into here. I'm looking at our time and recognizing we're not going to make this a 4-hour podcast episode. So there are probably a few bullet points that I kind of hoped. There's one bullet point that I hope to hit, which is I thought I'd lead with this, and we haven't even touched it yet, which is hilarious because it's central to the question of the day, which is, let me say this. The word worship is something that I don't even like that word. I don't even think, at least the way that I've always thought about worship in my mind, all powerful God who demands of me to kneel and prostrate myself and yes, oh holy God. That's not the kind of God. That's not how I understand God. I've never experienced a God like that. I know a lot of people have, or that's the default or the only possible option. And I totally get that and actually really respect it. I'll just say spiritually and through my life, I've just never encountered a God that demanded me to worship them, that required of me to show up and make sacrifices in order to gain that God's mercy or love or acceptance. I get that that's only one way to understand the word worship, but that is very much why I don't even like the word worship. And also why sometimes when I go to Sunday morning worship services, there are parts of it that I'm just like, what are we doing? I, are you sure everybody in here, are you sure you believe that this is the thing that you're supposed to do right now? Like, is this what's best? There's a part of me that's really cynical about some of those sort of systems and rituals that are set up because I think they're based on maybe a definition of worship that looks a little more like that exaggerated one that I just offered. So let me ask you, is that a really wrong way to think about worship? Do you have other people in your life who maybe shared that, I don't know, that I need to worship like that?
The more you said worship just now, the more I hated the word.
Is that one of those, the word becomes a sound? Worship, 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 worship. Is it?
There's so much to that. We do need a part 2 of worship gone wrong, or worship what is not accurate. What is bad worship? What is practice of false worship? Because there is the whole Old Testament, the whole of what Jesus is trying to kind of dismantle is this worshiping of false gods. There's like that whole other side. And I've often heard it like, show me your daily life, show me your bank account, and I'll show you what you worship. And so I think there's a distaste for so many people because it's been used for such good sacred connection. And it's also been used for such harm. And people are wrestling with that because they think of what you just explained as what some people experience, and it's miraculous and wonderful and exactly what they need in their lives. And for others, they've been beaten with that style of worship. And so there's hurt and there's harm that has been consequential of worship.
Well, because what I just described is power. And if power lives there, if there is an all-powerful God, and you, Dani, the pastor of my local church, are the transmitter of that power, and so therefore are a temporary holder of that power, that makes me, the congregant, in a really difficult dynamic with you and with the church as a whole, and for that matter, with this God that requires, that power. And that's why again, this is just me. It's okay if everybody disagrees with me on that, but I don't even like words like all powerful God. Like, huh? I think that is a lack of creativity of language, or just a limitation of language itself. I think what we're trying to say is something else, but the only words we have are all powerful God who requires worship.
Mm.
And I don't know. I just think language limits us and then creates dynamics and behaviors that can, to your very good point, become really, really damaging and really scary, honestly. And obviously, there's a whole lot of people who are experiencing that hurt, or who have experienced that hurt.
Mm-hmm. We are confined. We are finite. We only have our language, our dictionary, and we are so limited to the way that we can comprehend God. And that sometimes our fallback is liturgy, is hymns, is music, is ritual. And there's so much more to be explored about God and about the universe. One of my favorite scripture passages is at the end of one of the Gospels, and it says, much more. Jesus did so much more, but
Yeah.
I'm butchering it already,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we don't have enough to fill the world about all that Jesus did and all that God is. And I think about that in us trying to explain worship and us trying to explain what is sacred. And it's like, we don't have the adequate tools, the adequate vocabulary, the adequate anything, but we're trying really hard. Sometimes we do really well, and sometimes we fall very short.
Yeah. And this is why between is so important to me, because the only if language only provides us a vague outline, the only way to color in the rest of the picture is right here in
Mhm.
the space between us. There is power in you and I didn't invent new words or new language, but I believe if somebody listened to this, I believe that they might have a richer consideration of what worship and the
Mhm.
idea of sacred might mean for them. And that's what it means to color in the picture. The language might be limited, but we are not. Our interactions are dynamic and holy and sacred and filled with the potential, I think, that God breathed into us as a picture, as an idea. I'm just I'm so inspired by that, what happens in moments like this, Dani. Thanks
Mhm.
for this. Hey, we're out of time, Dani. Listen, there will be follow-up conversations, friends. If you're listening to this episode of the Between podcast, you can't wait for the next episode where Dani is a guest, and we'll record that sometime soon. Dani, any parting words, anything before we log off?
My hope is for people to take a pause and to recognize that God is with them, that they are already a beloved vessel of love and light, and that they don't have to necessarily change anything about them. They don't have to start membership at any church to be anything. They are already perfectly loved, as imperfect as they are.
Thanks, Dani.
Mhm.
I'm going to enter as many interactions as I can this week with a posture of gratitude, with a posture of sacredness, and with a posture of what worship might mean in a richer sense for me. I'm really grateful for this conversation, Dani. Hey, to you who's listening, go to between.church and sign up for all our stuff. I don't know how else to say this. Sign up for our email list, go to our Substack and subscribe, watch our weekly videos on YouTube. Follow us on social media, and you'll be a part of a community of thousands and thousands of people all over the world who have made a choice to bring their own faith tradition, their own understanding of spirituality to the big question of how can we create more moments of sacred human connection in our lives. And I'm grateful for my friends like Dani and my friends like you, listener, for helping to make this between community a reality. Thanks, everybody. Hey, my favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.